Between going on a trip to visit my parents back in Southern California and then now being in the process of a move by the time this video goes up, I am having some serious time issues. But I don't want to skip a week for you guys, so I found that I still had my original polychromos versus luminance footage of the cherries. So today I'm going to turn this video into a tutorial. Last time it was just a speed painting where you couldn't actually, I wasn't talking you through what I was doing. So here I have put down a piece of masking tape so that I could have a nice straight line from that back. So I'm using my polychromos, and I'm going to keep saying polychromos out of habit, but all of this entire piece was just done in polychromos. Now, if I were to do this again, I would use at least my white luminance for the highlights, because the white polychromos just does not do a whole lot. It's nearly worthless unless you're just using it to burnish, because almost no color comes out of it, so it's pretty good for that. But I'm just going through here. I'm working in small circles and laying black down on the entire background. This is going to take a couple of layers for me to get it as dark as I want it. You can see I've outlined the metal cup first so that I can keep that line nice and clean. I will almost always outline the edge of my subject whenever I'm doing any given area. This helps me keep everything nice and crisp and clean. If you're not outlining things when you go up against the subject, chances are you're going to keep it a little bit too soft and too fuzzy. So to keep your work really crisp, you just outline that edge. You don't have to push terribly hard, but by lining it, it'll definitely help you keep everything cleaner. Now, it does appear, because this is moving so fast, it looks like I'm almost scribbling, like just really long 1-inch lines back and forth, and I'm not. It's just because of the way that the speed of the video is. If you work that way to where you're almost just scratching the pencil back and forth in large chunks, it's really hard to get even coverage. So I'm working in smaller circles or smaller ovals here than it appears. And I'm overlapping one section into the next, again, so that I get really good coverage. I want to get a fair amount of colored pencil on the paper so that the color saturation, I want this really dark, really black. And I start moving the pencil to where I'm going different directions as well, so that that pencil really gets into all of the tooth of the paper. The tape that I'm using, doesn't have a lot of tack to it, so it kept lifting off the paper as I work. So that's why you see me continuously pushing it back down. Now, I have had some questions about tape lately, so since I don't really need to explain what I'm doing here through the whole black section, the tape that I use, if I'm using a lighter weight paper or something that's very soft like Stonehenge, then I will generally go with a black acid-free tape that I picked up from Jerry's Artorama. It is so much cheaper if you pick up that tape from Dick Blick or Jerry's Artorama than it is your local art supply store. The price of masking tape at the art supply store is kind of insane to me. It's really expensive. So if you pick up that, I would go online and get it. And this one is a pH, or not the one using here, but the one that you often see me use that's black. It's a pH-free or pH-neutral tape, acid-free, totally safe, but it's a little bit lower tack than regular masking tape. So as long as I remove it slowly, I'm not going to have a problem with it ripping the paper. Now, what I'm using here is a regular masking tape that I got at the grocery store, and it just happens to be very low tack. I hated it. I personally like a little bit more tack in the tape, especially if I'm working on paper like the Fabriano Artistico. That one is a heavier weight, thicker paper, so it's not so prone to tearing anyway, so I can use very high tack tape. Now, there is a bit of a difference in that because I get so much work done so quickly, I normally don't have tape on my work more than a few days. If you leave the tape on your work for months at a time, then it can start to cause a problem with the paper, and this is where going with that pH neutral artist tape that I got from Jerry's Artorama would be a great way to go. The thing that I like about that one is because it's black, you're not fighting with color of the tape. Like if you use painter's tape, which is also an alternative, you can get the blue painter's tape, which they have available in many other colors now. But the painter's tape is a much lighter, it's not as tacky. So you're not as likely to have it rip your paper if you are having trouble with that. I'm adding a magenta color on top of this. Now, I will not have the list of colors that I used for this because this was done so many months ago. I have no idea what I was using. All I can tell you is that they were all polychromos. But I'm layering the magenta over the black so that my black's not too flat. This gives it a little bit more depth. And with that, I was pretty loose. I wasn't worried about teeny tiny small circles. I just kept a very light hand and covered all of it with that. The brush that I'm using here is not the one that you typically see me use. This one is kind of a scrubby brush. It's a rougher brush. I'm not sure what the bristles are. The brush itself is not marked. It was one I got on clearance, so I can't even look at the store to see what it was. I'm guessing it's a synthetic hog hair, but it's got very short, scratchy bristles. So I like this a lot when I'm doing backgrounds like this that are really solid, just because it jams the pencil into the paper so well. So now that that is done, I need to let that dry. And now that I have coverage over the whole paper, I've put this time I'm using tracing paper. This video was done before I switched to using glassine. Not quite as good as glassine, but better than nothing. I'm going right over that again with the black, just to make it really dark. Now, I will have a real-time clip of this over on Facebook this week, so if you want to see how I'm moving my hand as I apply the pencil, you'll be able to see it over there. A little bit better than you can when it's sped up. You can see this is just noticeably darker when I get to the second layer. If you're having a hard time getting the color saturation that you want, just if you're using a light hand, you can add multiple layers. I mean, this is almost unlimited. I can easily get at least 20 layers of colored pencil before the paper will stop taking additional layers, as long as I use a light hand, so I can get that color really dark. Now, this is the Fabriano Artistico Extra White Hot Press 140-pound watercolor paper. This paper is really nice because it's super smooth, but it still has just enough tooth that the pencil has something to grip to. Now, one of the things that I liked about this one, because I was able to block in my very darkest color first, it made it a lot easier for me to judge my values on the rest of the piece. I always like to knock out the darkest areas whenever possible. Taking that magenta color and going right over that again. Now, you can't really see that I'm doing this here. It's just that when you look at it in person, it does have that bit of extra richness. It's almost like the black is even darker, which doesn't totally make sense given that you would think black by itself would be as dark as you're going to go. But adding this on top of it, it just gives it that nice rich feel. Now I've switched to my Taklon bristled brush. That is a Filbert, a white Taklon bristle. I'm going to wash right over that. Oh, looks like I switched brushes again. I have no idea why I did that. That was long enough ago. I can't think of a good reason why I switched brushes right here. Unless the other one dropped and I didn't feel like picking it up. Which happens a lot. So now moving on to the tin cup. I'm sketching out the darkest area on the inside. Now when you're doing silver or shiny things, all it is just paying attention to your reference photo. There's no magical trick or magical color that you need to use. You just want to copy what you're seeing in your reference photo. If it's light gray, draw it light gray. If it's dark, draw it dark. You would be surprised too how many other colors are in there besides gray. You're going to have varying tan colors and reflections for whatever is around it as well that it's going to pick up. But if you can train yourself just to pay attention to those lines and what you're seeing in that reference photo, drawing anything shouldn't be a problem. It's just a matter of copying what you see. So I'm outlining the cherries that are on the inside, and I'm blocking in the darks. And what I was seeing inside this cup while I worked on it, I had no idea what was what. I actually wasn't even sure that one of those back ones was a cherry. I didn't realize that till later on. But it's, as long as you're copying what you see there, once the work is finished, it generally all comes together. I'm sure you guys are sick of hearing me talk about look at it as abstract shapes, but that's really all it comes down to. Everything they're just random shapes. Just copy the shapes that you're seeing in your reference photo. And something like this is nice because it is pretty forgiving. If I've got a cherry in the wrong location, it's slightly drawn wrong, no one is going to notice the difference. This photo I picked up from Paint My Photo. So you are welcome to draw this yourself exactly as is. And Paint My Photo has changed, they moved, it's now pmp-art.com. And it's a little bit harder right now to find photos of what you want. I believe what's going on over there is not all of the photos that they transferred over have tags, so they're still working on tagging photos. So when you do a search, a lot of the photos that you might have liked aren't there anymore. They're technically there, they're just not tagged yet. They're working on that. So hopefully that site will come back to being really a great resource for us. Now here you can see I don't have my tracing paper under my hand, so my hand was resting against the paper. That isn't a good idea for two reasons. One, especially with polychromos, it gets to where it sticks to the side of your hand and it smudges easily. So I end up dirtying up the paper, which on this was no big deal because I was going to go over everything. If I needed that paper to stay white though, I wouldn't have gotten it back white where I smudged it. The other thing is you don't want the oils from your hand to get on your work because that damages the archival quality of the finished result. Anytime those oils in your hands, that acid gets onto the paper, it's really bad for it. You may not notice the difference, a couple years down the line, but long term, if you're trying to get your work to last a long time, you do want to get in the habit of protecting it from having your hand touch the paper directly. So I'm just paying attention to my light and dark colors in there, using a lot of grays. And here I've got this pumpkin color that goes right over some of this. It's reflecting the cherries because that is such a shiny metal. Now the inside of that tin isn't technically done, but I'm going to blend that out with the Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner. I recently tried Gamsol for the first time, and sure enough, just as expected, it works exactly like the Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner. So if you're not able to get the Mona Lisa wherever you're at, the Gamsol is there for you. The Gamsol also claims to be less toxic than any other odorless mineral spirit as long as used as directed, which seems like an odd little disclaimer. It costs a lot more considering what a small container it comes in, but you don't use that much of it, so it's definitely worth giving a try. But as far as the actual use, the odor, the dry time, any of that, to me, it felt exactly like working with the Mona Lisa odorless. I will continue working with Mona Lisa odorless myself, just because it's what I use for my oil paint, and so I buy it in larger quantities, so it just makes more sense for me. You've got to pay close attention to the lines when you're drawing a cup or something like this that's rounded. You want to make sure that all of the reflections, everything has to follow that curve. If you don't follow that curve for any lines or reflections, shadows, any of that, it can end up coming out really flat. That green that you're seeing me use is an ink eraser by Faber-Castell. That one comes from Mexico. The ones that are available here within the US or the UK, they have a cream colored casing instead of the green. They also have a little brush on the end of them to wipe away your eraser marks. But those work really well for colored pencil. They won't lift everything off completely, especially if you're using the odorless mineral spirits, because that makes the pigment saturate into the paper. But if you're just trying to lift off small areas or remove some of the pencil so that you can layer more on top, then they work great. But if you're trying to get your paper all the way back to white, that's not going to happen with colored pencil. You really have to plan out your drawings with colored pencil. You can't just start experimenting like with acrylic paint. I can start painting, and what happens happens. If it's terrible, I can paint over it, no big deal. You know, my bird's too far to the left or too far to the right. So I can fix that. It's easier if I plan it out, but you know, there are workarounds. With colored pencil, it's not as easy for experimentation as you work. It's definitely a good idea. Make sure that your drawing is drawn out completely 100% accurate before you ever start coloring. If you think that you're going to be able to fix it once you start, you know, the cup's a little off to the side, I'll fix it later. You're not going to. Once the colored pencil hits that paper, it's pretty much staying there. It's not very forgiving as far as that goes. So definitely make sure that your drawing is correct before you start, because if your drawing you realize is off and you start filling in with colored pencil, it makes for a really frustrating experience knowing that something is off and you can't easily fix it. But if you can be confident that your drawing is perfect, then it makes the coloring portion much easier. Plus it looks better that way. Now you can see that shadow that's kind of going along the middle of the outside of the cup there. Notice how my lines follow the curve of the cup. They're not just straight. Everything follows that curve. Blending that out with the odorless mineral spirits again. Now sometimes you will hear me use the term odorless mineral spirit. Sometimes I use the term Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner. Sometimes I just call it paint thinner. All the same thing. Technically, the Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner, it is an odorless mineral spirit, so it falls kind of under all those categories, but they've named it Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner, so that kind of gets confusing. But it's all the same thing. I'm just building up my values here. Now, if I have a video that I've done in the past where before I started adding voiceover and you would like voiceover for it, let me know which ones they are, because next time I come to a place where I need to reuse or add a voiceover to one of the older ones, it will give me a better idea of which ones you guys want most. See, I'm cleaning up the edges here. I've got to clean up that outside edge as well. Now, this is one of the things that I really like about using a black background. It is so easy to clean up your edges because I'm just taking the black pencil to do that with. So black is a really nice background as far as going into easy mode. If I had a gradient or any kind of fade with the blurry background, I have to spend a little bit more time color matching to make sure my background fades evenly as I clean up those edges. But with this, the black, it keeps it very simple. Plus, I just love the look of the black. The contrast here between that cup up against that black background, I think, is just stunning. The photograph that, I can't remember the name of the photographer, but the photo that she took is just beautiful. She did such a good job on her lighting. And that's one thing. If you're going to take still lives for yourself, for your work, which definitely is a great fun way to go. You end up feeling so much more proud of your work when it's something that you took a photo of. But when you take it yourself, the thing that you really want to watch for is your lighting. Look for interesting lighting, and usually that's going to happen unless you're using artificial light sources which is a whole other setup to do, right? But the easiest way to do is use natural lighting, and I recommend going with early morning or late afternoon to where the sun isn't directly above you. If you can get strong lighting on one side of your subject, you can get such beautiful photos, but that lighting will make things look so much more interesting, and here is a perfect example of that. This is a fairly simple photo. The composition, everything's simple, but the lighting is just striking on this, and that's really what is going to draw the viewer in. So when you're taking reference photos, the still life is a great way to go, and chances are you've got plenty of things around your house that you can take photos of. Just look for that interesting lighting. So along this background, I'm blocking in everything with the brown first. I'm going in opposite direction there that I did on the first layer so that I make sure that I'm able to get that colored pencil all the way into the paper. So the first time I did little circles, but I was going more horizontal. The second time I flipped direction to where I was going diagonal. I was still doing little circles, but they were more diagonal, so that transition was very, very solid. Transition's not the word I'm looking for there. The coverage was very solid there. So I'm taking this cream color and filling in the base. This would be another one that the luminance pencil would be a better one to go with, I think. I had a hard time because I had smudged some of the background, and getting this pencil to cover it did not go well. It's just too translucent. You can see it, there is some color there, but it's a very translucent color. So fixing mistakes or anywhere where I was messy and used my hand, dragged my hand across the paper and smudged the paper, that definitely is easier to do with luminance. The only reason that this is all polychromos is because it was the polychromos versus luminance video where I was doing one type of pencil for each. And I'm apparently missing a whole section of the video where I did the shadows there, but I just took the colors that I'm going to be using for the cherries and blocked them in over the background. Small circles, and then blended it out with the Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner. Sometimes I forget to hit record. So I'm darkening up that background even more. That has been blended out with paint thinner once, although you did not catch that on video because I forgot to hit record. I'm burnishing that cream color over my shadows. That's one thing that I think is really nice with the polychromos. The only thing I can find that there's a reason to use the cream or the white ever is for stages where you want to burnish, because almost no color comes out, so you get this beautiful smooth look with them. It's not as soft as you can get with the luminance pencils, but it is just good for burnishing, kind of like if you were using the colorless blender with Prismacolor. It's very similar here. The colorless blender doesn't work well with the polychromos. I'm not happy with the results there. The lighter colored polychromos work better for burnishing themselves. So onto the cherry, I'm paying close attention to where my lights and my darks go. I've got various shades of orange, reds, and pinks in here. There will be some browns as well. Now I've got to be really careful because I'm only using polychromos here. I have to be really careful to leave my light areas light enough because I'm not going to be able to lighten them up with an opaque pencil after, which is probably not going to be the case for most of you guys. The easier way to go here would be to get my colors fairly dark, blend them out with paint thinner, and then either use the Derwent Drawing Chinese White or the Luminance White to pull out the highlights and the shine marks. It can be done all with the polychromos as I did here, but I think it's a little bit easier if you've got an opaque white that you can put on top of it. You can see that shadow, that highlight on the side of the cherry there, both the circle and then the bottom little half moon crescent thing right there that I'm shading. You can see the contrast is really strong there, which may seem scary, but that really does make a big difference in making it look like it's a shiny area, making sure that your contrast is nice and strong. This is a case, copy your reference photo. If it's dark, draw it in dark. If it's light, leave it light. If you can get used to keeping your contrast really strong, that will make your work look so much more realistic. And these pencils were great because this project was really small. I believe this is a 5x7, much smaller than the 11x14 that I normally work on. But the polychromos sharpened to such a nice fine point, you can get a ton of detail. If you're working in Prismacolor, I would recommend work a little bit smaller. An 8x10 would be easier to get the detail that you want. I find it to be just kind of a pain because the Prismacolors don't like to keep a fine point very well. They'll work. You would be able to create this. Definitely would be easy to do in Prismacolor if that's what you're using because they do blend so smoothly. It's just getting the detail would be a little bit of a hassle. So again, if you're doing Prismacolor, I would recommend go with an 8x10 for this size at least. The polychromos, because they can get so sharp, then the 5x7 was just fine. And the luminance one that I did in this size was fine too because those pencils also get sharpened to a nice fine point. You can see I'm just layering and layering and more layering until I get my color saturation where I want it. The thing that's so nice about colored pencil is that you can take your time. Don't feel like you have to rush and hurry up and get any given area done. This is one of those things where you get to relax, and great for stress, that's for sure. But you can just relax. There's no rush. Graphite's the same way. You're not in a rush with this medium. So take your time, enjoy the process, but get all of those nice little details in there. Now here on the stem, notice I'm paying attention to where the highlights, there's some light and dark areas. And as small of a detail as that is, it really makes a difference in making it look realistic. One thing that I find I have to remind my students of a lot is make sure your pencils are sharpened. As you're working, if that pencil starts to get dull, whether it be graphite or colored pencil, sharpen it. When it's dull, the lead can't get in, besides the fact that you don't have much control for the fine detail, but the lead isn't able to get into all of the little crevices of the paper as easily. And so you're more likely to have that gritty, grainy look with a dull pencil than you would with a very sharp one. So when you're trying to get that more painted look with colored pencil, definitely keep those pencils sharp. Now when I start doing layering, when I get into my final layers, then I'm more likely to go ahead and let the pencils be a little bit more dull. But these earlier layers, it's really important to get those sharp. And having a piece of sandpaper next to you to sharpen your pencils will help them to last even longer, so you don't have to continuously sharpen them in a sharpener. Now for some of these layers, it looks like I'm adding a fair amount of pressure for these areas I know that are going to be very dark. That color that I was using was what I wanted, and so I could safely add a bit more pressure, get the color saturation really dark to start with. Normally I keep a very light hand as I work, but for that I was safe enough to go dark, and so I added the pressure to begin with. So you'll hear me say all the time to use a light hand, and more often than not that is the case. But there are times that you will find it looks better if you start adding more pressure, or you start burnishing. And here, on a lot of that, I was burnishing fairly early on just because I knew how dark I wanted it to go right there. I'm using black on top of that magenta, and then I will come back through, most likely, if I'm remembering correctly, I'll come back through with more magenta or reds on top of it so that the black doesn't just stay flat black. Either way, once I blend with the paint thinner, it'll mix in with the magenta that I already have there. You can see that my reflection here pulls out a lot of the pink from the cherries. The shadows aren't always going to be just varying shades of blues, blacks, or browns. They're often going to pick up whatever color that is causing the shadow. And here, if you look at this cherry right now, it doesn't look like a cherry. It looks like really weird shapes. Almost looks like a bug's face. But just copy those shapes. Copy what you're seeing in your reference photo because it will all pull together in the end. The other tip that I have for you is you don't want to look at it. I mean, you would look at it and say it's a cherry. It's red. I'm just going to use a red pencil and cover the whole cherry with that. That's going to look very flat, and you end up with a more cartoony look. When you want something to be realistic, look how many different values and shades that I've got in there. Just continuing to build contrast in there, making sure that everything's very rich. But the other thing that you're seeing me do is overlap some of these colors, like where I use the pink. I overlap it over the pink and the magenta. What I'm doing by layering it over both areas, the light and the dark, is pulling those together. You can still see the separated areas between the light and the dark, but it's more seamless. It's a much smoother look, which makes it look like all one piece instead of kind of a jigsaw puzzle of color. And I do that a lot, whether it be for painting or for colored pencil. I will get my contrast in there, get my layers in there, and then go back over with a single color over everything. And it just pulls everything together well while still maintaining the separate colors. It's almost like it softens that edge a bit. And that magenta color, it's a bright magenta you're seeing me use. That one isn't, it looks like it's really bright, but once it mixes in with the other colors, it isn't really going to be that purple. So again, notice how sharp that pencil is for those first layers. You know, the image here is a bit fuzzy. This is back when I was using my old video camera. It's funny because I don't realize how bad that camera was until I compare it with the new camera. The bonus is that old camera never had the horizontal lines going through the image problem like I tend to run into now. You can see I'm taking this red and I go over the light and the dark portions, which pulls it all together. I'm using a very small brush to blend that with the paint thinner. That one is a number 6 flat brush. That is a white Taklon bristled brush. You can see once I get a cherry next to any given area finished, that I go back to some of the first cherries and hype up contrast a little bit just to separate them. And you'll see me do that on everything I work on. I did it a lot on the flamingo. I would work on several feathers, move out to other feathers where those first feathers were mostly done. Once I got the feathers next to them blocked in, I could go back to those first feathers and better judge my values. Go back and separate lines, strengthen the contrast between one area to the next. And really, with the rest of these cherries, this is just a rinse and repeat process. Doing the same thing over and over again. Now, when I draw things over and over, like the flowers, the roses that I recently did, I found myself getting really bored after the first one because it was the same thing all 3 times. With the cherries, or when I do grapes and stuff like that, it's not as tedious to me to do the same thing again and again because each one of them at a different angle, there's different shapes, and it just, for some reason, I don't find it to be quite as tedious as drawing the same flower again and again. But this is such great practice if you want to work on your blending skills, especially if you're interested in doing portraits. Getting to learn how to layer these colors, not that these are the colors you would use in portraits, but layering your colors and getting that smooth transition from one color to the next. Great practice because it's fairly forgiving. If some of your lines are off, your shadows are off, no one's really going to notice the difference. On a portrait, they will. But doing this on flowers, or in this case, cherries, apples, fruit, that sort of thing, anything where you have to do a lot of smooth blending, it is just great practice for when you get into doing portraits. Now notice the shiniest portion on each of these cherries I've left completely white. Let the white of the paper show through, especially with the polychromos. If once you get that dark, the white is not going to whiten it up all the way back up to white. I've got to let the paper show through. But that should be the only really white portion on any of these cherries. The rest of these, the highlights are more reflections, and so they're going to be tinted with light pinks and oranges instead of just being white like that shine. The other thing that you want to notice, look at the shape of these shine marks on the cherries, the reflection. The first one that I did, you've got this almost kind of smiley face, or the way that it's curved around the rose. I just recorded the rose video, so I keep wanting to call everything a rose today, but curved around that first cherry. That curve makes the cherry look rounded. This is what's giving you that 3 dimensions. So you want to watch the shapes. Even though I say that they're abstract shapes, that doesn't mean that you can just draw them in any manner you want. Just draw a bunch of random shapes. Copy your reference photo. Make sure that your curves are going in the right direction, because that's all going to build up to making everything look 3-dimensional and rounded. If that line went straight, if I missed the fact that that was supposed to be curved and did a straight line across, it would suddenly flatten out that cherry. Even though the outline is correct, the shadow being correct matters just as much. This is where if you trace your work, I know a lot of people will say it's cheating and you're just paint by number at that point. You're not, because you still have to be able to freehand all of the shadows and everything inside. So if tracing is the way that you like to go, you're still having to perfect your drawing skills as you do this, because you've got to pay attention to the fact that is a line curved, is a shadow straight, all of those little things build up to making a good finished product. Plus, if you're tracing things, that's cleaning up or perfecting your drawing skills anyway, because if you do something correctly over and over again, you are going to learn much faster than if you keep making the same mistakes over and over again if you're freehanding it and continuously drawing it wrong. Now, the other thing to notice here, every single one of these stems so far has used fairly different colors. Some are more green, some are more gold. I mean, you've got a lot of different colors in these stems, depending on where the light is hitting it. So this isn't something where I'm just going to draw all the stems the exact same way. It won't look right. It won't look natural. Having variation in things is a pretty big deal. Whether you're doing fruit or roses, landscapes, no matter what it is, pay attention to having variation. If everything is too uniform, it looks too stiff and fake. Now, anywhere where I want to be pretty light, I add the white pencil down first, and I add a fair amount of pressure so that I'm burnishing the paper a bit, which helps protect it from picking up too much other colors when I start layering those in. Not quite as good as using a wax-based pencil like the Luminance or the Derwent Drawing Chinese White or even Prismacolor White, but better than nothing. Whenever I use a lot of magentas or reds, you will always see me use orange, and the other way around. If I'm using a lot of oranges, I will use a lot of the magentas. Those colors look so nice together, and they just complement each other great. So it's one of the few things that I do as a general rule. Even if a photo that I'm using has a lot of orange and I don't see any magenta in it, I'm going to add magenta anyway. It just makes the oranges pop that much more. And the other way around. I do the same thing on animals. If I'm drawing an animal that is a tan color, whether it be a lion or a giraffe, I'm going to use a fair amount of magenta in with those colors. Mostly for the shadows. And you don't necessarily even in those cases realize that you're seeing magenta, but it makes your colors so much more rich. You can see I'm taking this color and pretty much going over everything, which pulls all of the colors together really nicely while maintaining my lights and my darks. It's one of my favorite things about the polychromos pencils being, well, there's lots of favorite things about those, but one of them is being that so many of these colors are translucent. I know a lot of people will complain about that they like the more opaque colors. That's what I've got my luminance for. But with these, with that translucent, you can layer and glaze like you would with paint, so I can tint the color, pull everything together. I can get such a realistic look with these pencils. The other great thing is just that they sharpen to such a nice fine point. I think I just cheated there and used a white Prismacolor. Oh no, that's still the polychromos. I must be pushing pretty hard because it showed up pretty well. Now the color that I'm using right now, I believe that one is one of the two that are not very light fast in the set. They're not as bad as some of the Prismacolors, but they're not one of the really light fast. You've got a star rating on all of those pencils, and that's one of two that is not so great. So I normally don't use that on work that I'm going to sell, but this one I didn't sell. I gave one to my father-in-law for Christmas, and then I've kept the the luminance version. Actually, I don't even know which one I kept. One of them I kept, one of them I gave away. But because I'm not selling it, I didn't worry about it, and I used one of those colors that I don't normally use in my work because it's not light fast. So watch that in your whatever colors you're using, no matter what brand it is. If you're using a brand that has any colors that are not light fast, I do recommend pull them from your set just so that you don't have to worry about that later on. But here, it was really no big deal. Now, one of the biggest deals here is just keeping your work clean. On something like this, when you're doing animals, you can have some fuzzier lines depending on what it is. When you're doing fruit and still life like this, keeping your edges clean is a really big deal. Notice how crisp, well, it looks a little fuzzy on this video, but notice how crisp that I've got all of these lines. That really makes a difference in your work. You can see that my background goes right up against my subject. You don't want to leave an outline or be afraid to overlap one color into the next so you end up with that kind of glow or outline. All the colors touch each other, and then I've used harder lines where needed for shadows to really make some of those lines, those edges, very crisp and very clean. And a lot of that is just keeping my pencil very sharp and adding a little bit more pressure than normal for some of those edges. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm outlining everything. It's just that some of those have heavier lines, and I've added more pressure with the pencil where needed to make sure that those lines are crisp. Some lines are going to be soft. Portions of the cherry where it's really light up against the light color of the background, that will stay soft. I'm not worried about that. But the darker areas, the shadowed areas, those I want to make sure that that line is very crisp. Anywhere where there's going to be high contrast, I want those lines crisp. So here I've gotten my darker areas blocked in, and now I'm going over all of that with my gray. Let me know too if there are certain subject matters or shorter how-to videos that you would like me to see me do. Definitely let me know in the comments, because sometimes you guys give me some great ideas. I will be doing a video fairly soon of drawing water reflections with colored pencil. And that was from one of your suggestions. Now here you can see everything just looks really heavily outlined. It looks like a cartoon. As I keep blending, all of that's going to become much more realistic looking. And I've done a video showing you how I use Photoshop with an eyedropper tool to check my colors for any given area of the piece. I cannot recommend doing that enough. It is just so helpful when you can't figure out what a color is. You might be surprised how often you've got oranges in an area where you never would have guessed. So that is definitely really helpful in learning what color to put where. If you do a Google search or a YouTube search for Lacree and Photoshop or Lacree color match, those videos should come up showing you how I do that. So onto the leaf. I feel like I was way messier here than I should have been. I rushed through it. I recommend take your time, get your lines a little bit cleaner than I did here. If I had had a white pencil or a wax-based white pencil, I think I could have cleaned everything up and made it look a lot better. But because I rushed through this and didn't plan out my lights enough on this, I had a really hard time getting things light enough that I needed to, and I just it felt messy and a little bit fuzzy to me. So learn from my mistake here. If you're not using that wax-based pencil, you've got to plan things out a little bit better on where you're going to keep your light areas, because it's really hard to put them back in with the polychromos pencils. And the leaf is like everywhere else. I'm just looking at it as abstract shapes. I'm not looking at it as I'm drawing a leaf right now, because if I do that, it's not going to come out looking very realistic. It'll be very cartoony. Instead, I'm looking at just copying those shapes. Blending that out with a paint thinner. These colors that I have here are just, like I said, I did not plan them out well. I probably should have practiced or tested the colors, the layering them on a separate piece of paper, and I did not do that on this piece, and I was never happy with that leaf. And I was so determined not to come back on top with a wax-based pencil, but I know I could have fixed it had I done that. An opaque pencil that was light could have toned down a lot of this and pulled out highlights. But this is another example. Even if you have an area of a piece that you don't love, finish it anyway, because somebody else is going to love it. There's no reason to just stop and give up. Learn from the mistake and move on. I'm not sure that I would call the whole leaf a mistake. It's just, I think I could have done a better job. While that dries with the paint thinner, I'm going over and doing some touch-ups on the handle of the cup. Now, getting the reflection, those colors of what is around it, is so important in making it look like metal. If I just do this with black and white and gray, it's not going to look like metal. It's just going to look like a gray cup. But I want it to look like it's reflecting the colors around it. And to do that, to really make metal look like metal, you've got to pick up those colors. Whether that be the reds or greens, the browns, all of that needs to be picked up into the cup to make it look shiny. That's what makes it look shiny and not just like a flat gray. I'm using the ink eraser to pull out some highlights here, since I don't have an opaque white. So I think I've given up on the leaf, and I am moving on back to the cherries. That leaf is definitely a lot messier than I would normally like my work to do. If it was something that I was doing that I knew I was going to make prints of or sell, then I'm going to spend more time perfecting it. But this being that it was just a demonstration for the Prisma, or this was the Luminance versus polychromos, I was like, yeah, good enough. I'm done fighting with this. I was having a little bit of a tantrum, wanted my opaque wax-based white, and gave up. You can see I'm leaving the white showing where needed, working around that with my pinks and magentas. Now, I found that I burnished a lot more on these cherries than I normally do. Normally, I depend more on the light layers, but here, just these small little areas, it was a lot faster and a lot easier to burnish earlier on a lot of these. And again, when I use the term burnish, I just mean that I'm adding more pressure with the pencil so that I'm jamming that pencil into the paper. which gives me a smooth look, but also limits how many layers that I can do. I'm more likely to burnish on a small area than I am on large portions. Burnishing also hurts my hand because you're having to add so much pressure, but being this is so little, it really wasn't a big deal. When I worked on the Color Soft, the Derwent Color Soft colored pencils, I found that the paint thinner didn't really work, so I ended up burnishing most of that, and that was such a large piece. That really hurt my hand. Blending that with the paint thinner. And even if you do burnish an area where you're adding a lot of pressure, you can still blend it out with paint thinner. You can see I've smoothed everything out there even more. Now, the really nice thing with blending out with the odorless mineral spirits is that if you're using a wax-based pencil like Prismacolor and you're getting too much wax buildup, sometimes that paint thinner will actually lift some of the wax off the paper and allow you to get even more layers. It still won't give you as many layers as you can get with the polychromos, but it does help. It also seems to help so that I don't end up with wax bloom later on. Sometimes with Prismacolor, because there is so much wax, months later or weeks later, you'll start seeing wax kind of build up where the whole piece looks a little foggy. You can take a cloth, like an old t-shirt, and just wipe most of that off. It sometimes can smudge a little bit, but not normally too bad. You can wipe that off. If you're using the odorless mineral spirits, usually that won't happen. I really don't see the wax bloom pop up once I switched over to using odorless mineral spirits with them. And all of these translucent layers on top of each other, you just get such a beautiful glow where it looks like you're seeing through several layers of that outside section of the cherry. So it doesn't look flat at all. And that red I've layered over any of the blacks that I have around it so that it's not too that flat black. And that cherry is a really good example of really weird abstract shapes. That doesn't make any sense what I have drawn there so far, but it all comes together in the end. If you look at this now, all of those shapes that didn't make sense, as it all comes together, you can see they look so nice and shiny. And that really was the goal here, is to get the reflections, make them look shiny. So as weird as some of these shapes seemed at the time, when it all comes together at the end, you get that really nice effect. Adding a bit more shadows underneath some of these. Now, one thing that's really nice, if you have put down your white polychromos first and then you burnished with it, when you add other colors over it and you realize you went too dark, when you use that ink eraser by Faber-Castell, it does lift most of the color back off the paper. So if you plan out where you know you're going to want things light, if you accidentally go too dark and you don't have the wax-based pencil, this is a way that you can go to make sure that things stay light enough in the end, or that you can lighten them back up in the end. Down to that last cherry. I've added the white first. Now I'm coming on top with the lighter colors around it. Now I've got to make sure that that edge between the cup and that cherry is really crisp, very, very clean, because the cup should overlap on top of the cherry, or it is in front of it. Now, I have people ask all the time which I prefer, if I could only do polychromos or only do luminance. I wouldn't want to have to choose. That would be a really tough call. I love both pencils so much for different reasons. But if I absolutely had to, I could probably get away with doing just the polychromos and then a few luminance, a few of the opaque luminance on top. Definitely the white. The violet gray is another of my must-have with the luminance pencils. But the polychromos, because I do so much fine detail, that pencil being that it gets as sharp as it does, I think if I had to choose, I would probably go with polychromos and a handful of luminance. But the luminance, if you just go with the luminance, those ones do just fine for detail. They're not, the pencil doesn't get as sharp, but it still gets a good amount of detail, much more so than Prismacolor will. So before, I know people will ask which one should you go with. It is up to you. That is a hard call. You're not going to be unhappy with either pencil. They're both just amazing pencils to work with. But definitely for me, I have to use both. I don't think I would ever want to go back to having to use just one or the other, because they both do such different things. The luminance when I want more opaque looks, and the polychromos for the fine detail. I also like the luminance best for portraits. For hair, I like the polychromos, but for skin tones where I really want to get that smooth blending, the opaque luminance pencils I like the best. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. Also, don't forget, let me know which of my older videos that you would like to see voiceovers for next time I redo one of these.